Chapter 4 of Abandoned by William Clark Russell. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Starzik. Abandoned by William Clark Russell. Chapter 4. A Change of Mind. The cabin servant, as we have seen, knocked upon the door of Lucretia's berth, but obtained no reply. He applied his knuckles more boisterously, and Captain Reynolds turned in his chair at the head of the table to look and listen. "Doesn't she answer?" he exclaimed, springing up. He tried the handle and strained the door with his shoulder. The key was turned in the lock. Reynolds smote the door 4 or 5 times with his fist, crying, "We must force this door if you will not unlock it." And this he shouted in a strong, stern note of command. His face changed when the silence continued beyond a few seconds. He cried with the swiftness of alarm, "Go forward and tell the boatswain to lay aft at once with tools to force this door." John sprang up the companion steps as though driven by a bayonet. The ship's pitching and tossing filled the interior with all sorts of noises, and though Reynolds bent his ear in such passion of attention as rose to pain, no sounds that he could attribute to the lips of Lucretia reached him. "I hope to God nothing has come to her," said he to Mr. Featherbridge, who had risen from his meal and was standing beside his captain and friend. "She has not been seen all the morning, sir." "She has not come on deck," said the captain. "She breakfasted, and John reported her to me as all right." But whilst he spoke, Lucretia's threat to her mother to poison herself if her husband attempted force or broke through the door recurred to him, and before the boatswain arrived the man's heart was wild with anxiety and apprehension. The daylight in the companionway was eclipsed by the intervention of a figure, and down came the boatswain, who was also the ship's carpenter, a sturdy seaman named Martin Webb, whose eagle nose stood out like a flying jib betwixt a pair of whiskers standing from his cheeks like the frill of an enraged hen going open-beaked at another. "As quick as you can, Webb," said the captain. And after a few sounds resembling the hammering of the old-fashioned carpenter before the old-fashioned anchor falls from the old-fashioned cat-head and fills the hollow forecastle with the roaring of iron links in an iron eye, the door flew open, and Reynolds rushed in. What did the others who stood in the doorway behold? Merely a woman with dark red hair, and a face of the pallor of virgin wax, lying in a bunk under an eider-down quilt with half-closed eyes, motionless in the prostration of that dire distemper, seasickness. The wash-basin was on the deck beside her bunk. One arm overhung the bunk-board, and the hand with its long, nervous fingers was suspended just above the deck, and looked as though shaped from the petals of the moon-lily. Reynolds knelt by her side. She was not dead, but she was scarcely conscious, and the whites of her eyes visible past the lashes of the half-sealed lids, made of her face such a counterfeit presentment of death as might have misled a skilled medical inspection. The husband felt the pale, cold, hanging wrist, and found a thin pulse in it. Then, lifting the hand and placing it upon the eider-down, he turned his head, and asked Featherbridge for a wine-glass of brandy and water, which was immediately procured and given to him. Nodding at the fiddles on the toilet-table, he told Featherbridge to bring him that bottle of eau de Cologne. He put his arm, with a wonderful tenderness of love and sympathy, under his wife's head, and succeeded in draining some brandy and water through her lips, and extending his handkerchief to Featherbridge, he bade him soak it with eau de Cologne, and this he put to his wife's forehead, kneeling beside her, watching, and now waiting. "My poor sweet," he thought, "alone, and so ill, almost dying. Oh, why, dearest, do you wish to abandon me?" He told Featherbridge to finish his meal and close the door upon him, to relieve the second mate, and to instantly report if a shift of wind happened, as he would get under way forthwith. And he was left alone with his wife, whose lips he kissed, whose hair he smoothed, whose hand he caressed, until in about half an hour she exhibited some signs of returning animation. The white lids lifted, and the rich brown irises rolled down, but fireless, though with a little life of wonder in them when the shape of her husband filled their horizon. Throughout that afternoon he hung over his wife, never suffering the tenderness of his ministering to be affected by her silence. that silence which is more irritating than a sneer, as an expression of the aversion she sought to render as manifest as nausea would permit, of the wounding and inflaming nature of her resolution to release herself from him and preserve the severe chastity of the beautiful, passionless, faithless, and cruel ego which she doted on, and whose deliciousness was not likely to cloy her. No, the sweet idea of her purity was not to sicken her soon, if ever, and there was his deception to resent, and his outrage on her liberty to punish. Never once would she answer him, though his few appeals to her to be his wife were most affecting with his pity for her sufferings, and eloquent with his love for her, and sweet with his contrition for the trick which had betrayed her to her honourable place by his side. She did not know where the ship was. She would naturally bring the ignorance of a schoolgirl to the sea. What could she have told you about the English Channel? Had she been informed that the town of Deal, which she had visited when spending a fortnight at Ramsgate, was within a 20 minutes' pull, she would not have been too seasick to have demanded her release, to have raged in her request to be put ashore. But the vessel was rolling and pitching, and Lucretia was convinced that the Flying Spur was miles out of sight of land upon the ocean, sailing on a voyage of which the contemplation was like that of eternity. Towards sundown Captain Reynolds sent for some tea, cake, and thin bread and butter, and placed the tray by her side. She would not look at him. She would not speak to him. No corpse could have been more mute under the grief-stricken gaze of the mourner. He went to the door with a dark face, and removing the key from the lock, turned to her and said, "I would not advise you to bolt yourself in. At sea, tragic surprises come in a moment. If we should be run into, so that the ship might easily founder in 5 minutes, how are you to be rescued if you shoot this bolt or turn this key, and are too ill to leave your bunk, or lie in ignorance of what is happening?" He paused to hear if she would answer. Her response was a sneer and a diligently averted gaze. With a heavy sigh and a hot heart, he walked out and went on deck. This man had dreamt of a long honeymoon on the ocean. He and Lucretia would have watched the sunset together. He would have explained to her the heraldry of the sky, talked of eyeless fish and water 3 miles deep. She would have viewed with him the moonlike bleakness and desolation and lifelessness of the iceberg. He would have instructed her in the causes of the colours of the ocean, why it is green, or grey, or blue, or black. In his handsome young wife he knew that he could, and she had been willing, have found a companion whose intellect was capable of translating the pictures she viewed into a wide poetic and romantic meaning. Such behaviour as hers, such a disappointment as his, might well clothe the manliest and most cheerful spirit in crape, and deeply black-edge the remaining pages in the story of his life. He paced the deck alone, lost in thought. The beacons of the sea were here and there leaping into the dusk from the lightships off that yellow serpent of shoal called the Goodwins, ashore from the windy headland whence streamed a far-reaching splendour, from the forestays of moored ships, and the familiar red eye of the port lantern went sliding up channel, dimming yet the shadow that conveyed it, and the familiar green eye stole glimmering down, wan and elusive as a glow-worm on a summer evening misty with dew. It was still blowing a fresh moist breeze from the westward of southwest, and a starless night was at hand. The waters ran in flickers of froth and broke into sounds of sobbing along the bends, and the tall masts waved in stately measures, growing spectral under the translating wand of the dusk. Featherbridge stood in the waist, leaning upon the rail, gazing shorewards. A riding light shone on the stay forward, and shapes of men were on the forecastle, but you heard nothing but the noise of the wind aloft and of streaming waters, and a dreary clattering of booms ill secured. After many turns, Reynolds went to the side of the mate and said, "Featherbridge, she is making me the unhappiest man under God. Shall I persevere? Shall I send her ashore? I have her, and I tell you that the idea of parting with her is hell to me." "Well, sir," answered Featherbridge after a little thinking, "as I ventured to tell you when this scheme came into your head, it seemed to me, and I still think, that had you taken this voyage and left her to her mother, you would have found her all you could wish on your return. It is a state of mind that wants time, and I fancy that violence will harden it." Captain Reynolds looked during a considerable interval at the lights ashore, and then, with a stamp of the foot and a slap of his thigh, he burst out vehemently, "No, by God! It has given me great trouble to get her. She is with me, and so far as that goes, things are as they ought to be. I'll not part with her. If time is to operate ashore, why not here? Here there is at least the constant appeal of the sight of me, of the knowledge of my presence in the ship. But she ashore, and I away? Why, this craze might induce her to take some extraordinary step. Her mother has no control over her. She might enter a convent." "Not as a married woman, sir, I think," said the mate, with a slow shake of his head. "A married woman!" exclaimed the captain, with bitter scorn. "Is it the wedding ring, is it the words uttered by the priest that make a woman married to a man? No, I've got her, and I'll keep her." The wind shifted at daybreak. It had slipped well into the eastward of south, and was a clear, steady breeze. The boatswain summoned the crew of the Flying Spur to get the ship under way. The windlass was manned, and the castanets of the pawls timed the chorus which accompanied the entrance, link by link, of the cable through the hawse-pipe. The date was the 10th of October. The morning broke fair, with a fine high sky of feather-shaped clouds. The sea was a magazine of colors and floating life in motion, for all the outward-bound vessels were getting their anchors, and the sun poured a delicate pink light upon mounting canvas and leaning shafts of cloths, the dark red sail of the coaster, and the white wings of the yacht. Old Deal stretched salt and sweet as a fresh mackerel with its wool-white line of surf and its greenish sparkle of window to the risen day-beam. On the Flying Spur, sail by sail was set until the ship was clothed in breasts of cloth, narrowing at each summit, 3 pyramids with curves of canvas like the seagull's wings between, and glowing with the soft purity of untrodden snow in that autumn morning sunshine. When breakfast was on the table, John knocked on Lucretia's door. He was told to enter, whence it appears that the door was not bolted, whilst it could not have been locked, as Reynolds had withdrawn the key. The captain was eating some breakfast, and the mate had charge of the ship. The cabin servant, coming out of Lucretia's berth, stepped to Reynolds' side and said, "The lady asks for some tea and dry toast, sir." "Is she dressed?" "Yes, sir, the same as yesterday. She is lying in her bunk." "How does she seem?" "She looks nicely," answered John. "Get her whatever she wants," said Reynolds. His brow was heavy with thought as he sat alone eating. It was not difficult to see that some consideration which had suddenly visited him had sunk deep and was perplexing him. There was in his glances from his plate to the bulkheads about him, and up through the skylight, that imperious vivacity of eye which tells of a soul in storm and conflict. The lightning of the mind was in his regard. He closed his knife and fork, left his seat, and tapped on his wife's door. "Who's that?" she asked. "I, your husband, Frank." She did not answer. He turned the handle and walked in. She was seated in the armchair, very pale, but sleep and time had discharged the sunken hollow look of nausea, and the very neglect that her hair discovered rendered her the more admirable and pleasing to his sight. When he entered, she looked down and stared with riveted eyes upon her lap as though she was in some hypnotic sleep, and the lashes of the lids were impenetrable veils of dark red golden hair. But he observed that she had formed her mouth into a sneer, and there was scorn and wrath in the dishonouring facial expression. It was as though he was a spider or a frog. "Won't you speak to me, Lucretia?" he said. She held her eyes steadily fixed upon her lap, nor did her sneer change by so much as an effect produced by a single touch of the pencil. "Won't you even look at me?" he said again. Mary come up, not she. He stood viewing her for a little with a frown, but as she would not look at him nor speak to him, he left the cabin, feeling mortally humiliated. Here was conduct that was darting lances into his amour-propre, and his spirit writhed with the pain of the wounds. The old poet says, Sweet are the kisses, the endearments sweet, when like desires and like affections meet. Where was he to find sweetness in this union if she held on as she was? Was he not her husband? Was he not a gentleman? It is true he had brought her into the ship by a stratagem, but surely the love that lay at the root of his action should woo and win forgiveness for a greater offense than that. On pardonne tant que l'on aime, says the French cynic, and Lucretia's inexorable resentment, vital even in the prostration of nausea, was an augury he could not misinterpret. He had used her with a chivalry which the majority of husbands would have held her unworthy of. Moreover, her behavior was belittling him in the eyes of his officers, and the gossip of this strange affair would reach the forecastle, and he understood the character of sailors well enough to imagine that what might be said in that hollow, humming sea-parlour with much expectoration and a vast variety of oaths would not contribute greatly to the dignity of command and the requirements of discipline. Once the swelling bosoms of the sails had taken impulse and life from the wind, the flying spur proved herself nimble of heel. She sloped her masts and slanted her cutwater, and bit with a keen foretooth into the gleaming curves, filling the air round about her bows with beauties and miracles. The lightning of foam, the rainbow of the prism, the emerald green and diamond white of gems. At noon the wind headed the ship, and she broke off 3 points with her yards braced well forwards. Dinner was served to Lucretia in her cabin, but in the afternoon, about 3:30, when her husband was on deck, she made her appearance and stood in the companionway, holding by the hand that wore her wedding ring, and stared about her. A very fine form, as Jack at the wheel thought, her eyes dark and glowing like the heavens at night, her lips slightly parted as though in relish of the sweetness of the wind that swept betwixt them. She stepped out and crossed over to Mr. Rolland, the fat, warm-coloured, yellow-haired second mate, and addressed him as though her husband had been left ashore, or was dead. "In what part of the sea is this ship?" she asked. "In the English Channel, madam." "Are we far from England?" "There is England yonder, madam," answered Mr. Rolland, with a smile that seemed satirical but was not, pointing to some blue films hovering over the sea-line on the starboard quarter. "Have we left Falmouth?" "No, madam, we are making for Falmouth." "When are we likely to get there?" "Why," answered Mr. Rolland, looking aloft, "the wind's drawn ahead, and we're off our course, and shall have to go about unless the breeze shifts again. So that," said he, with a rather nervous look in the direction of the captain, whose interpretation of this conversation with his wife he did not like to think of, "I don't expect we shall reach Falmouth much before late on the 13th, or it may be the 14th. She looked at the films of land with a hard pale face of resolution, and it was impossible even for Mr. Rolland to miss observing that she had arrived at a determination to take a step, and that this time she meant to score. Captain Reynolds was pacing the weather side of the quarter-deck when she arrived. She went to leeward to the gangway so as to remove herself as far from him as possible without invading the precincts of the sailors' quarters, and she stood with her arms resting upon the bulwark rail, looking at the horizon, or at the forming or dissolving mounds of water, or at 2 or 3 colliers and a screw-tramp with raised bows and the outline of a cow lying down. 2 sailors were working side by side forward. That they were British and not foreign seamen may be judged by the following sentences that passed between them. "Fine young party that! What's called a piece of all right." "She's the old man's wife," answered Bill, meaning by old man Captain Reynolds. "'Ow d'yer know?" says Jim. "Ain't she a-treatin' of him as if she was? If she warn't his wife—" and Bill, with a wink, nudges Jim in the ribs. "What's she doin' here if they don't get on?" said Jim. "Think he's goin' to leave the likes of her ashore?" answered Bill. "He'll wait upon yer. Where'd she be when he tarned up? A wife may be like a bad thick un, sights better than the real thing to look at, but you're darsen't spend un. You've got to keep carryin' of it about. Yon's a thick un without much ring in her, you lay." "Not even the weddin' ring, p'raps," said Jim. "Oh, I allow you'll find that all right. He'd live in fear of us men." "'Ow's a man goin' to command a ship that can't command a woman?" asked Jim. "If a woman won't answer her ellum," replied Bill, "what are you goin' to do? You bet the old man's tried it hard a port and hard a starboard, and what luffin' 'ud do, and if Ellam's alley would mix nicely in the biling. I think myself, said he, very gravely, that some women is best left alone. If they prove unmanageable, then turn to and secure the ellum, and you'll find the party'll take up her own position, and ride comfortable. It will be judged from this fragment of conversation that Captain Reynolds had not erred in the anticipation of his forecastle's comments. As 8 bells, 4 o'clock, were being struck, Lucretia left the rail at which she had been standing, and walked up to Mr. Ralland, who was in the gangway abreast of her. Captain Reynolds continued to stump his lonely principality of quarter-deck betwixt the wheel and the skylight. "Of course," exclaimed Lucretia haughtily, "you know that I am the captain's wife." Mr. Ralland, staring at her, stuttered "Yes," and instantly looked ill at ease. He was waiting for Mr. Featherbridge to relieve him, and disliked this being talked to by Mrs. Reynolds in the presence of the commander of the ship, whose despotic importance was great enough to ruin him, and the whole estate of this fat involuntary cynic lay in his calling. "I was brought to the ship by a base stratagem," said Lucretia, "and I am imprisoned in her, as you are easily able to see. I desire to return home to my mother. Will you tell your captain that if he does not allow me to leave the ship at Falmouth, I will ask the sailors to help me to free myself? I will appeal to those men who will not allow a woman to be ill-treated. I have always heard that sailors are warm-hearted, and I beg you to tell Captain Reynolds that unless he liberates me, I will go right amongst his crew there and tell them my story." So saying, she slightly inclined her head, and went towards the companion hatch as Mr. Featherbridge stepped out of it. She darted at him the lightning of her eyes under the shadow of her frown, and sank down the hatchway out of sight. Mr. Ralland, with a mind slightly muddled, was about to go below to compose himself over a pipe and a book in his bunk, throughout the first dog-watch, should there not come a call for all hands. Captain Reynolds called him. "Mrs. Reynolds has been asking you questions, I think?" The second mate coloured up, and answered that she had. "What does she want to know?" "Where we are, sir." "Yes." "And how long it will take us to fetch Falmouth." "Yes." The fat and purple young man hung in the wind, and after a cough or two, said, "She asked me to tell you," and he quoted Lucretia's threat, word for word. "Is that all?" inquired Reynolds, whose expression of face was stern but calm in rigidity. "That's all, sir." "Thanks." Mr. Ralland slunk to his quarters. The captain took a few turns, then catching Featherbridge's eye, he invited him to his side by a toss of the head. "She'll do at this for another hour," said he. He looked aloft and to windward. "Featherbridge, I have formed my resolution. I have made up my mind to send Mrs. Reynolds home when we arrive at Falmouth." "I am sure I think you will be acting wisely if you do, sir," answered Featherbridge. "She is not to be conquered. She is not to be got at. I could not have believed that her heart was so hard. I make every allowance for her indignation at being trapped, but is there no love in her to help me? Nothing left of the old feeling which induced her to take me?" The captain's voice trembled slightly, but his face continued stern and tranquil, with the tranquillity of the marble face whose expression is that of deep resentment and a heart on fire. And in truth, it was quite possible for the slow-souled Mr. Featherbridge to suspect in Captain Reynolds a languid motion of mind that must presently harden into aversion, for the elasticity of even such a love as this man bore this woman has its limitations. The tissues crack, the passion sinks shapeless. It takes another name, and a feeling that may threaten the wreck of 2 lives replaces the ruined sentiment. "I did what I thought it was right I should do," continued Captain Reynolds, "and I find that I was mistaken. My blunder arose from an imperfect knowledge of the nature I was dealing with. Could I foresee that the change that has come to her would prove as fixed as though it had been inherent? Which it never was, for so help me God, no woman could have been more tender, more sweet, and docile in the privileges she permitted. Many will tell me that I have not acted the part of a gentleman, but I am a man, and I feel as a man, and she has not treated me as I deserve to be treated by her. Featherbridge, you will continue your kindness to the end. I will ask you to see her ashore. No doubt her luggage will have been received at the station before our arrival." He broke off. He could not bring himself to say more. He was unmanned, and went to his cabin to collect himself. Throughout that night the ship was a frequent scene of disturbance. The wind headed her off her course, and to prevent her from running now into the coast of France, or now into the coast of England, the captain put her about, an evolution in merchantmen that is commonly attended with great uproar. Men howl upon ropes as they drag at them, the captain shouts, the mates bawl, the ship plunges, staggers, stops, and reels. The wind roars in the shrouds. The fingers of the gale sweep the canvas into a slatting like a volleying of stones from a quayside into a hold, and there is much confusion below of nimble crockery and sliding commodities. When it comes to "let go and haul," the fore-topsail yard swings, the jib-sheets leap the stays, the ship leans, and after a pause of thought lets drive her keen tooth into the surge, which parts in slinging and singing masses of giddy splendor, and she is again off and away, with her sailors coiling the ropes over the pins, and the captain and mates staring aloft to observe the lay of the yards and the set of the canvas. The scene is one of inextricable complexity to a landsman's eye on a fine day and in summer waters. But in the darkness of an autumn Channel moonless night, when a strong head sea is running, and the work is to be discharged by two only of the 5 fallible mortal senses, namely touch and hearing, the scene, or at least as much of it as is visible, takes for the landsman an element of fear, and passengers have been known to go to prayers on their own account when the ship was in the agonies of mainsail haul on a dark night blowing hard, the captain suspecting that the white water on the horizon was breakers, and that he was several leagues out of his reckoning, and the mate convinced that if she hung another minute she would be in irons, and they would have to wear ship, shoal or no shoal. When the flying spur was put about a little before 9 on the night of this day we are dealing with, the noise on the deck was so great that Lucretia in her cabin believed the vessel was sinking. The ship, as the helm was put down, met the seas and pitched heavily. The rudder jarred. The tramp of feet overhead was as though all hands were fighting for their lives to get into the boats. Lucretia heard shouts and loud hoarse bawlings, and white with fear, with a heart beating quickly, for she could not but remember what her husband had told her about the ship being run into and sunk in 5 minutes. She opened the door of her berth, but nobody was in the cabin. It was all hands on deck, and John was amongst them. She stood waiting and hearkening in the doorway until she grew reassured by the comparative silence on deck and the steady floating motions of the ship, and then John's legs appeared on the ladder, and the man descended. "What is the matter?" cried Lucretia. "We've been putting the ship about, mum," answered John. "What do you mean by that?" "Laying her on the port tack for another board, mum." Had he answered her in Chinese, he would have been equally intelligible. "Is there any danger?" she asked. "Lord love me, no, mum." On which she closed the cabin door upon herself, not choosing that her husband should descend and behold her. And then she sat down and cried with rage and other emotions, and detested Frank for bringing her into such a situation, and vowing, whilst she mopped her fine eyes with her pocket-handkerchief, that if he did not release her at Falmouth, she would go amongst the crew, plead to them to help her to free herself and gain her end, or render her husband's situation as captain of the ship impossible. The night passed, a night, as has been said, of commotion and going about. At the breakfast table, Captain Reynolds asked Mr. Featherbridge to visit his wife and acquaint her with her husband's intention to send her ashore at Falmouth. There had come a shift of wind in the morning watch, and the breeze was so blowing as to allow the ship to look up for her port. The morning sunshine clothed the glass of the skylight with silver brightness. The sea ran with a cradling motion. Through the scuttles you caught a glimpse of the sparkling azure of it. Mr. Featherbridge did not relish his mission, but he faced it like a man, and ascertaining from John, after Reynolds had left the table, that Mrs. Reynolds had finished her breakfast, he walked to the cabin door of the lady, and knocked. Who was that? She wanted to know. "Mr. Featherbridge. I have come with a message from the captain. May I enter?" She immediately concluded that his errand was in the interests of peace and conjugal felicity. "I decline to meet you, and beg that you will not come in," she cried. "I believe the news I bring is what you will be glad to hear," said Mr. Featherbridge. After a pause, during which she thought of the doctor's certificate and the livery of trouble Featherbridge had cunningly worn during his interview with her mother at Chepstow Place, she said, "You can come in." He entered, bowed, and said, "I have been asked by Captain Reynolds to inform you that you will be put ashore at Falmouth, according to your request." She stood holding by the table, swaying her fine figure with the motions of the deck. Her face slightly lightened as though to a sudden brightness of heart, but the expression soon faded. "It is about time that Captain Reynolds acted like a man," she said coldly and haughtily. Mr. Featherbridge secretly wondered what o'clock it would be when Mrs. Reynolds should think it time to act like a woman. "The captain expects," says the mate, "that your luggage will be at the station, and I shall do myself the pleasure to attend to that and see you off." She curled her lips at him before answering, and said, "I shall not want to be seen off, thanks. I am quite capable of looking after myself. I shall require some money to pay my fare. I had but 2 sovereigns which you saw me borrow from my mother." "Captain Reynolds will see to that," said Mr. Featherbridge, who thought to himself, "If you were the only young woman in England, damn if I'd have you." She turned to the scuttle or little window, in token that the interview was ended, and after a slow look at her, Featherbridge walked out. He went to the captain, who was on deck. "She is very willing to go, sir, but she won't allow me to escort her. She wishes to go alone." "She shall have her way," answered Captain Reynolds in a hard voice. "How does she seem?" "Quite well, I think, sir." "A stubborn soul. A very stubborn soul to bend," said Captain Reynolds, as though thinking aloud. "Such spirits need but a very little bending to break. I never could have believed it of her or in her." "How does she look, do you say?" "Why, very well, sir." "What a fine creature to love and lose, to have and not to be able to hold," continued Reynolds, still talking as though he was thinking aloud. "I suppose she and I will never meet again." "I wouldn't think such a thing, sir." "Oh, my God, look at the chances against our meeting!" cried the captain, with a little storm of passion coming into his voice out of his heart. "It's not the risks only of our lives at sea, there's her nature, which will hold her aloof, and the longer she remains divorced from me, the severer will grow the quality that keeps her divorced. A child, oh, a little child, something to humanize her, something to look with my eyes into hers." He stepped to the rail and stared away to sea. Featherbridge stood still. The captain returned. "I suppose her reception of you was cold, perhaps insulting," said he. The mate answered, "No, sir. She says she wants some money. I saw her borrow £2 from her mother, and she changed one when she insisted on paying for her ticket at Gravesend." "I'll see to it," said Reynolds. Half an hour later he went below. He had lingered on deck trusting his wife would appear, for he loved to look at her. He entered his cabin, and opening a locker took out a desk, which he unlocked, and from a corner of it picked up a small roll of Bank of England notes. He took 2 5-pound notes and placed them in a blank envelope, then stood hanging over the desk for a little while, musing. For a small parcel of his wife's letters lay there, and they set him thinking. He replaced the desk in the locker, and putting his head out called to John, and told him to give that envelope to Mrs. Reynolds. He then got into his bunk to take some rest, for the night had been full of business for him, and his whole being felt strained. End of chapter 4.